the stalwarts, aren't they?
Yes.
Is Austin not even here yet?
No.
Oh, strange.
I'm sure he'll be here. I did speak to him yesterday. I'm sure he'll be here.
I mean, I would assume so.
I'm sure he'll be here. He might be teaching or something. I don't know. I'm sure he'll be here shortly, yeah. I want to hear what he's got to say about compression.
Me too. He and I are supposed to work on a project together, so it's a good opportunity.
Yeah.
To know us work a little.
Well, I think it's one of those areas that I think is quite big obviously in the music production side of things, and certainly something I've toyed with for years.
Hi Steve, hi Jeff.
Hello.
Play a little bit of audio today, Jeff. That's all okay. Just thought if I'm talking about compression, I may as well let people hear some of it.
Indeed, yeah. You've used this lectern before.
Yeah, it should be okay. Let me just get it set up.
Hello.
How are we doing? You okay?
Yeah, good.
Yeah. It is the Extron Scalar, Jeff, is it? Yeah, that's the.
You can use an auxiliary if you prefer.
No, it just whatever.
It just means that you can then control it more independently.
Whichever is easier.
I mean, if you see the.
Oh, is there a little
the jack? I tend to use the jack because then you've got full control.
Yeah. All right. Perfect. Yeah.
Which I think is you need
that
to
one,
select. You need to go to separate audio source.
Okay.
Aux
is it?
Yeah, that'd be X
Yeah,
because that's VGA. Yeah.
Cool.
And then you've got
Yeah, let's
you're
try
not
that.
tied into you've got your own Mac volume control.
Let's try that then, yeah.
I generally find that a bit more friendly
Yeah, it is.
than the scaler, unless I've got no choice.
Excellent. Switch over then.
So just choose your
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, hope should be.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah.
Hopefully, yeah.
Sometimes it says headphone
Headphones,
port.
doesn't it?
Sometimes
Yeah.
it says headphone port, doesn't it? But
Yeah, yeah.
well, if you plug something in, it depends on the system, I think.
See what it picks up.
Test it out first.
So where's my? So it's control here.
Yeah.
Yep.
Check. Did you select it on the lectern? Select aux.
Oh yeah, maybe that's why it hasn't found it. Yeah. So maybe now if I go to that, it'll find the external headphones.
There we go.
I
Yeah.
guess. Interesting. Okay, it
There you
works.
go.
Brilliant.
And then the volume on there
That
works as
one,
well.
yeah.
And you've got independent control too. Yeah.
So if I max that up here, I can just control.
I-
Well, I'll not max it.
I
but
wouldn't max it.
yeah.
It tends to be one of those scales that suddenly kicks in
Oh, okay.
right at the top.
One of
you know,
those, is it?
but,
I think that's loud
Yeah.
enough. Cool. Brilliant. Wait, no, 3 minutes.
yeah, suitably compressed audience.
Yeah, Stuart. I think Laws is coming for the first half hour. I think
Eric's normally here.
Eric can't make it.
Oh.
He spoke to me yesterday, so he's got I think he's been asked to do a Teams presentation at this time.
Was he?
I think Stuart's got a meeting.
That's the way it is sometimes. But yeah. Well, I'm actually an avatar, and I'm representing the whole of the university through me. So
That's
don't be
it.
fooled. I'm a fully functioning sort of humanoid avatar.
That's it.
So,
Okay, right, brilliant. So it's
you can't tell the
you're
difference.
kind of like an AI bot for the university,
Yeah,
then, right?
yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
A large language model for the university. That's
Yeah. Well, the tech is way beyond that, but yeah, it's.
Well, we give it another minute or two and see.
Yeah,
what it turns
yeah,
up,
yeah.
shall
We
we?
might as well just get going.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And if you haven't met, this is one of my master students, Robbie. He's just joined us recently.
Yeah, I do
actually.
recognise you
You
from
might have
somewhere or
seen
other.
him
Anyway, yeah,
once.
around the place probably. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is Jeff Cox, who's a lecturer here, and this is Steve Waxman. You might have heard me talking about the amplifier project, so Steve's running that. So Robbie's looking into clarity in music production, so it's
Clarity.
clarity, yeah, with
Clarity, as you would say.
music.
The opposite of distortion.
Right. Okay. So today I'm gonna talk through. It's kind of quite interesting. I think probably one of the first presentations I actually did as part of one of these research groups was based on the original study that I'm going to talk about today, and that's kind of branched off a little bit. And so what I've been doing is a kind of process of updating this study that I originally started as part of my PhD, which is kind of like morphed into something much larger. So that hence the sort of further insights into dynamic range compression. I'm also going to touch on another paper that's not quite published. We're just sort of working up that at the minute, which is a little bit. Yeah, it's connected to this. So it's connected to just this overall kind of study of compression. So if you're not familiar, that was my big thing that I studied was compression. So whenever I did my PhD, I ended up specifically looking at the 1176 compressor. But to actually get to that point, I had to kind of do quite a bit of research into compression to sort of understand that more, well, not necessarily more generally. I had a lot of understanding of compression from working in the industry and teaching and so on. But I wanted to kind of get a kind of more robust perspective on it from studying it, from carrying out a research project into compression. So one of the first things I did is my PhD in 2014. And initially at that time, broadly speaking, I wanted to understand the kind of how and why of compression, right? So how were music producers using compression? Why were they using it? You know, there's lots of anecdotal discussions around that, lots of interviews, lots of, and more so even today with YouTube channels, is an unbelievable amount of discussion around compression. But nothing had, at that point, apart from a few studies that actually kind of looked into it and tried to present it as an academic study. At that time, and again, and this was where the further insights comes into play, at that time I had some slightly different kind of aims. When I started my PhD, I was primarily looking at hardware compression, so that was something that I was specifically looking into. Didn't really consider software compression so much at the time, although it was unavoidable. And then in the end, as I said, my thesis looked at the 1176 compressor. But this kind of was one of the first kind of exploratory steps or stages in that study. I ended up presenting that at various conferences and so on. Always received good feedback. I remember I had a colleague, Joe Bennett, come up to me at the time. I didn't really know Joe at the time, but he was, going, "You've got to publish this. You've got to publish this study." And unfortunately, it remained unpublished. Until recently, when we kind of set up the SMPR, and some other people, again, who were familiar with that study, saying, "Look, you've got to work this up. Let's get that study worked up. Let's either publish it as part of the new journal or perhaps send it to all the journals." But I had some concerns. One of the main concerns was that the study was quite out of date at that point. So that was one of my number one big concerns. So I wanted to make it more up to date. And this is the kind of further part of the title. Okay, but after I started doing this, I started to have more concerns, which I'll talk about in a second. Okay, so the reason why I want to play some audio, so if you're unfamiliar with kind of the nuances of compression, we've got some little images here of, I guess arguably the four main groups of compression, if you like, or compressors that come from those four main groups of compression. So an 1176 compressor that's based around a kind of FET technology, an LA2A which is based around opto, DBX160 which is a form of a VCA compressor, and a Fairchild which is a valve style compression. Now the reason why they're called that is because that's how they achieve the gain reduction. So it's a FET, a field effects transistor in the 1176 that handles the gain reduction. In the LA2A, it's an opto cell, basically a light shining on a cell that creates more resistance, that creates more compression, more or less, for the LA2A. DBX160 got a specific voltage control amplifier that handles the gain reduction there. And the Fairchild is based upon varying the bias of a valve. In terms of kind of like historical evolution, I can't remember exactly, but it's basically these two, then onto that, and then the most modern kind of form of technology before we shift into software compressors are the VCA style compressors. Now, I'll just come back to that in a second in the Pro Tools project, because I've got some digital emulations that we can kind of have a listen to, and I'll kind of explain the affordances of those compressors in a second. At that time, again, what I wanted to understand was, firstly, what are the common reasons for applying compression in the production process? So, I mean, obviously a no-brainer is people want to compress signals, but there's got to be a bit more to it than that. I also wanted to know what musical sources are frequently subjected to compression. Again, that was generally what I wanted to do. But I wanted to kind of understand, okay, are there any specific compressors used for those sources? And again, what are the reasons why engineers or producers, mixers would compress those sources with those specific styles of compressors? And then also I wanted to get an understanding of kind of the terminology used, the descriptors, the language used when describing the sonic output of the compressors. So the kind of sonic signature, as I started to call it. Essentially with a compressor, if we think about it, really it's kind of changing the timbre of a sound, right? And that can be quite obvious. It can change the time domain aspect of the sound. So it will reshape the amplitude. But also, as we know, when it reshapes the amplitude, that's going to have a result on the perceived sound quality. But as well as that, it can have an effect on the spectral content of the sound, and depending upon whether it's got any distortion occurring inside that compressor circuit, it can also start to impart some distortion characteristics. So essentially, it turned into, and part of my PhD turned into, a kind of timbre study that was around compression. Okay, so those were the kind of key questions. If we if you just flip back into this Pro Tools project, so what I've got is lined up here, just some different compressors, okay? So we can just have a listen to the, well, it's actually, to be perfectly honest, sometimes in an environment like this, when I've matched things quite closely, you're probably going to think, hey, there's not much difference at all, which is sometimes the case. But I think what's more interesting is the kind of user interface of these compressors, because that's definitely a big part of it, okay, what it allows the user to do. So let's just start off here with a kick drum source. Let's just turn this up a little. And we got no compression on that, apart from maybe a little bit when it was tracked. But as we can see here with this compressor, the LA2A compressor, in terms of the user interface, really the only thing that we've got to do that can control the compression behavior is this control here, the peak reduction, okay? And then this makeup gain will allow us to compensate for any reduction of level because of the compressor. And as you can hear now, I pushed that into a fair amount of compression, match the levels roughly with it out. Okay, what we can hear is it's more smacky, okay? So we can hear an increase in the transient portion of the sound, and also because of the compressor's behavior, it's got quite a slow release. We're actually pushing down the decay of that kick drum, okay? So in a way, we've rebalanced the envelope of that sound, yeah? We've enhanced the transient. It's got a slow attack on it. Let's let the transient through. And then because of the slower release, it's pulling down the decay portion, okay? So we've ended up with what we might call a sort of spikier sound, right? Yeah, a bit spikier, punchier, okay? Now obviously I'm over-egging this a little bit in the room today, so we can see we're getting, well, the meter's showing me whatever it is, minus 10 dB of gain reduction, so quite a lot, but, you know, I'm just doing this as an illustrative exercise. But again, there's not much we can do with this, really, as a user, okay? Which, interestingly, at the time, that wasn't a kind of big, what's the word, focus of my kind of exploration, but it's something that I definitely did discuss in the discussion of these results, okay? Is that the impact of the user interface is certainly one of the reasons why people are selecting compressors, and it's also one of the reasons why they select them for maybe specific sources. Moving up to this one again, so we can see, okay, apart from all of these controls, yeah, this is kind of resembling what you can see on the hardware design. Apart from, so this is just allowing you to select what the meter shows. This is literally just allowing you to put more input into the compressor, so it's just basically a gain control. This is allowing you to set the threshold point. Forget about all this stuff down here, it's just extra things, sidechain filters and so on, that really wouldn't be as apparent on the original hardware unit. But the main thing to actually control the compression behavior, again, this is just this control, which literally just steps between a stepped control that literally just steps between 6 positions, yeah? So again, if we go back to this one, so this is just the Fairchild. So I've got that sound, 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 I got that sound. Okay, and we go back to this one. Yeah, and you can hear very subtle differences, but really what's happening is, in a nutshell, we're slowing down the behavior of the attack and the release as we go down to the higher numbers. By the time we get to the 5 and the 6, we're going on to a kind of automated attack and release, where it kind of tries to adjust the attack and release depending upon the program material. So if it's more transient, it's going to be faster. If it's more steady state, which of course this example isn't because it's a kick drum, then it would adjust it to slow it down and so on. Okay, so it's kind of got like a multi-stage approach to trying to make it a little bit more what's the word, adaptive to the program material. But again, and we can see that there's reasonably there's not really much for the user to do here. Okay, by the time we get to, say, our 1176, we can see that we have a little bit more control now. So we do have specific controls over the attack and release. We didn't have any ratio controls in the previous 2 compressors because they were fixed. Okay, so we've got more kind of control over the device, which can allow a little bit more flexibility in terms of, you know, what the user can achieve. So probably the biggest change that you might hear with this compressor is the release control. Okay, so a much bigger effect is now we move the release control. Okay, the compressor's got a much larger range in the release control. Okay, so we've got a more. First of all, we've got control over that release now. Not just with the fixed stepped control that's changing both the attack and release. We've got control over that range. The attack, on the other hand, if you close your eyes, and I sweep through that control, I'm pretty sure not many people will really hear a significant difference. Obviously not trying to influence what you're hearing, but I'm sweeping the whole way across the range of this control, and it's not doing a great deal. Okay, it's doing something, but the range of that control's in kind of microseconds. Yeah. Okay. So it's got a fairly limited range. It's basically it's a limiter. Yeah. So really, the range of that is, I guess, more for technical reasons. Okay. So again, remember, a lot of these devices, were actually designed for broadcast. Yeah, they weren't really designed originally for use in music production. Although the 1176 was, I think, originally designed with music production in mind, but the previous older compressors, such as the, I can't remember the names of some of them now, but originally were designed for broadcast, cinema, and so on. Even the Fairchild was originally for mastering; it wasn't really for mixing or production, and then it kind of found its way into the studios. But yeah, so the attack control, I guess, really is allowing the user to adjust it. So maybe a peak slips through in one setting, but they capture it in the other one. It mightn't necessarily be audible to the listener, right? So they're trying to capture very fast-moving peaks, fluctuations in voltage. But in terms of what we hear as a listener, it's fairly limited, right? But the other thing with 1176 is we can also get it to go into more extreme compression, right? We can actually achieve more compression with this device. And the other big thing with the 1176 is if you misuse it, yeah, and you push the buttons in, okay, we can kind of get it to sound probably in ways that the original designers didn't intend it to sound, right? Yeah. So in actual fact, when we push all those buttons in, what actually ends up happening is that it kind of goes out of its what's the word? It's kind of like a design state, if you like. So the bias gets thrown out in the electronics and so on, and it kind of malfunctions in a nutshell. And part of me finds it hard to believe that the designers didn't put these 4 controls on there, because they're just crying out for someone to push them all at the same time, right? And they do. You push them all at the same time, and you get that effect. So I find it hard to believe that the designers didn't think someone was going to do that at some point. Yeah, and when you do it, you get a really interesting sound, and that became a kind of cliche over the years of compression, right? This kind of explosive, distorted sound, and you'll hear, if we go to a source that perhaps is allowing us to hear that effect more obviously, if we go onto this drum room, and again, if I step through these compressors here, so let me turn it off. So, pop on the LA2A. Let's crank up the peak reduction. Let's turn up the gain to compensate. Turn it off and on. So we can hear it's kind of made the drums a little bit more energetic, a little bit more explosive, a little bit more, giving it more character, I guess. Okay. If we shift to the Fairchild, let's go to that. Again, we're probably going to get a sort of similar effect. Yeah, okay. I have a little bit more control over it this time. I can go for that sound, or I can go for that sound, right? So I can have it a bit more relaxed because of the longer attack and release, or I can have it a bit more energetic. Okay, a little bit more control over that one. Now if we flip forward into my 1176, and we go back and we do that all buttons thing, and we do that, you're going to get that sound. It's a bit like this, yeah? And we can adjust the release controls, and we can make that pump and move a little bit differently. And I've taken a drum sound that's that, and done that to it. Okay, so we've added tons of energy, tons of character, tons of distortion. Okay, and it kind of, in a way, this is kind of like, you know, repurposing the compressor, I guess, and turning it into a distortion box. And just going back to the, in terms again of the usage, so I'm just trying to set up some use cases here so you can understand the discussion. Where compressors, so you're kind of thinking, well, the VCA compressors, okay, well, okay, what do they offer? Well, really, if we go back to a kind of good example of one of those compressors in software form, so these kind of compressors came out, I think, kind of late 70s, mid to late 70s, so DBX, and this is trying to look like a DBX. They kind of like pioneer VCA style compression, but it's kind of arguably probably the most commonly found form of compression nowadays. So, you know, the vast majority of compressors in a channel strip and a mixing console, like an SSL or any of these things, are based around VCA compressors. In terms of any of the prosumer stuff, the cheap stuff, you know, the Behringes and so on, back in the day would have been VCA-based compressors. You know, the relatively inexpensive DBX compressors, VCA compressors. So they're probably the most commonly found form of compressors, and they will, what's the word, allow more scope of control. The first thing you can get with a DBA compressor, and as compressing technology developed, the first thing you could get was more compression. Okay, so we could achieve more compression with these types of compressors. So as we moved from the opto to the Fairchild to the FET to the VCA, we were able to get more gain reduction from the compressor, to the point if I crank this up on this kick, I can kind of compress it to the point where it's that. It sounds like that. It sounds like a blip. Okay, I've compressed it so much. Okay, that essentially I've just turned the signal down, in a sense, right? Okay, just compress it. So, and let's be honest, that's what compression is. It's just turning the signal down. It's an automated amplifier. But if I taper that back to be a little bit more sensible, still a lot of compression, you can see that I've got a lot of scope of control with this. This attack now, having a big effect, okay? Whereas on the LA2, 11F776, you might remember, hardly any effect, right? So it's got a big, wide range of effect now, okay? And the same thing with the release, okay? So I've got much more sound design control, I guess, okay? So this is where we get into the compressor just transcending beyond a simple device to control the volume, essentially control peaks, to a device that we can use for sound design purposes. Okay, so and that's quite important to understand, that control. Okay, the control over the attack and release, and that's that kind of thing. So essentially, what we can kind of take home from that just quick demonstration is we could use a compressor for general peak reduction. Okay, to just doing the job that we would expect a compressor to do. We could use a compressor to very, significantly manipulate the time domain aspect of a sound, so the envelope of the sound, using the attack and release. We can use a compressor, as we can hear, to distort the signal. And we could use a compressor, also, you might have heard me said, it sounds more energetic, it sounds more this, it sounds more that, to generally change, I guess, the kind of perceived energy and a performance, right? We get to just transform that aspect. So there's multiple things we can do just beyond compressing the signal. Okay, so that's I kind of from this study. So backtracking now into the study. So the study, and again, this is a development of the study that I started out as part of my PhD. So there are limitations, which I'll explain as I go through. So the first thing, with when I was doing this for my PhD, I made a decision to rationalize that I wanted to focus on only compression around drums, bass, and vocals. Okay, which it kind of came up as part of my literature review and part of my general reading as the kind of typical things that producers were compressing. They were compressing other sources, but those were the type of sources that they spent most time talking about specifically. So that was one of the focuses of the study, to specifically look at those sources, but also I would lump together all the sources into like a more broad category. It was just for, at the time, it was, I guess it was just expedient thing to do at the time. The material used, and this is based on the extended material, okay? So when I updated this, but I think my original study went from 1999, so it looked at articles from 1999 to, it would have been 2011, I think it was. And then recently, then I updated this from 2011 to 2024. So the articles were coming from, it was essentially a qualitative study. The Sound and Sound magazine had kind of collated all of their articles from classic tracks and the secrets of the mix engineers into a nice compendium, so it was very easy to use that as a source. And I think at the time the Mix magazine had done the same thing with classic tracks, so they put all those articles together so you could literally go through them from month to month over the different years. So that was the material that I targeted for this analysis. It covered a diverse range of genres, rock, pop, hip hop, and so on. At the time, I didn't record that. I wasn't as concerned about that at the time. I wanted to get more of a general understanding, but as time has progressed, I realized that was a limitation. In terms of the analysis, I explored the text for discussions on compressor use, compressor types, descriptors, producer's motivation, discussions around that. So it was essentially a kind of thematic analysis. It used a kind of combination, I guess, of grounded theory and content analysis. So I was using the kind of content analysis to count the frequency of occurrence of things, to kind of get some numerical data, and then using the grounded theory side of things to kind of get that understanding, to build the themes. Essentially it was a kind of a mixture of this type of thing, okay? So in terms of extracting the descriptors, just to give you an understanding and maybe of how these codes emerged, okay? This is a made-up code, but for example, and it's made up, but it's actually quite typical of the sort of things that you would read a mix engineer saying. We use the 1176 on the drums, so I would put that as a count, 1176, drums as a count, snare, put snare as a count, and then to what was crunchy, okay, to bring out the top end. So crunchy, kind of synonym for distortion, bring out the top end, adding additional harmonics to the top end, therefore affecting the frequency content of the top end. So it's kind of distortion to impact coloration, okay? So there's obviously it's an inductive form of analysis. There's a little bit of me inferring the meaning from this here, but I think it's probably a reasonable, assertion to make that they were essentially using distortion to change the frequency balance of the sound. So it was kind of trying to make it as objective as possible, but again, while working around the constraints of what is a subjective process, right? We're trying to kind of understand the meaning. So in terms of gain reduction style, so this was looking at, so with this, we had a compressor type, so FET stat, so the 1176 styles of compression are green, the opto styles are this kind of yellow color, the valve styles are this kind of purple color, VCA are in this red color, and then other we can see in this blue color. Okay, so we can kind of see that there is some some kind of patterns emerging. Typically for the vocals, it's a FET or VCA approach to the compression. On the bass, it's kind of that pattern still applies, although there is maybe a valve and VCA emerged as also popular choices in that sense. In the drum shells, we got something a bit different. We have VCAs as a more popular choice. Over the drum rooms, it's not kind of as cut and dry. We can see that there's some other styles of compressors coming out. And then in general, the general source, it was the FET compressors that were kind of marginally the most popular styles to use. Now what's interesting is that, for example, on the drum shells, obviously one of the reasons for that being more popular is because the increased attack and release times afforded the mixer more scope to adjust to transients. Okay, so that explains that one. In the vocals, once I looked at the discussions, I could see that really, in terms of vocals, it was almost, do we want to make the sound more aggressive and upfront, which would the 1176 would do, or do we want to make it a little bit smoother and more relaxed, okay, which the LA2 would do. And this was as a product of the attack and release times, okay, so the 1176 is a very fast moving compressor, slower moving compressor. So you almost kind of get these two kind of schools of thought when, for example, approaching vocals. What do we want to achieve sonically? What's the kind of aesthetic, I guess, that we want to impart on our vocal? Shifting on. So that's generally kind of a summary of those points which I've made, and we can kind of see that there's some times when we do have this kind of contrasting sonic signature kind of emerging as a reason for the choice. As I said, the VCAs were coming out as that most popular choice in the shells. So when I say shell drums, kicks, snare, toms, often because of the increased scope of the compressor's attack and release. So I think I've discussed that. Yeah, sorry, just going back to the rooms actually. Again, there was, in these groups, so what do we got? We have our VCAs, VCAs, the FATs, and the Optos. I think across the board, actually, they all were sort of, there was not one that was any more so popular than the other. We can see a little bit, I think probably the least popular is the Opto compressor, and that's to do reading the discussions because of the lack of flexibility with that compressor. It's kind of got a fairly slow attack and a slow release, and it doesn't allow the users to get this energetic pumping sound that we could achieve with the other compressors with the faster options. Okay, so it seems like they were going for either a kind of distorted drum bus, like I just demonstrated with my demonstration, or something that pumped and moved and modulated, okay, that created this kind of pumping effect. So next thing is kind of interesting to look at some of the descriptors that people used, or that were used in those discussions. So these are the kind of things that I pulled out. So these were the descriptors that people used when they were directly talking about the output of the compressor. So they were sort of saying, for example, yeah, it sounds, it gives it control, or it sounds aggressive. Okay, suck is typically, most people are talking about that as in this pumping, sucking sensation. Okay, so you can see that there is some patterns of music: pumping, suck, aggressive, color, crunch, bite, smooth, in your face, upfront, trashy, warm, round, distorted. So a lot of the times when the producers were discussing the sound quality of the compressors in these articles, it was more to do with the coloration effect, right? As I discussed previously, this change or transformation of timbre from the compressor, whether that's because of what it's doing to the time domain of the signal, or what it's doing to just generally the kind of coloration of the signal. And again, we can think with compressors of essentially two things. If we think about it in terms of an acoustic signal, we can have the transient of the sound, and then we can have our, even if we think about it like a synthesizer, right? We can have our sustain and our arcade. So we got to think which part of that sound is the compressor impacting. And again, what would be the perceptual effect if it impacts the transient more than the steady state and sustain? So I would argue that these things like kind of distorted, the kind of coloration things, edge and so on, or perhaps punch, and what else we got, smooth and so on, are perhaps more so to do with the impact on the transient. Whereas things like the suck, the pump, the sustain, the explosive, etc., are more likely to do with the steady state portion of the sound, or the decay portion of the sound. Although, of course, there's going to be lots of crossover. So again, just kind of cutting to some of the results. So in terms of the kind of grounded theory, as I said, I wanted to get some more, I guess, objective, quantitative data from it. So I kind of worked out kind of percentage proportions of those discussions that were around these different areas. So obviously, you're all probably familiar with grounded theory, so inductive thing, I kind of no idea. I didn't have any set codes or categories, and these are the codes and categories that came out of the analysis. So the kind of, and then these are the raw codes as I put them up. Okay, so we can see someone was talking about, I wanted to make the snare more punchy, more spiky, more whatever it was. Then that basically, if you bring it down to an acoustical level, is someone affecting the transient of the sound. If we wanted to make it more pumping, sucking, or whatever it is, and the discussions were around that, it's effectively a modulation, an amplitude modulation effect. Okay, linearity was in the few instances where people talked about, I didn't want the compressor to be heard. Okay, I did it so it was invisible. Dynamic control is just general. I use the compressor to even out the bass performance. Distortion is someone where they clearly said, I wanted to make it sound more grindy, I wanted it to sound more trashy, I wanted it to sound distorted. And then the coloration general and coloration frequency is discussions around things like attitude or character, or these kind of words that are a little bit more nebulous that you can't quite ascribe onto some more kind of technical category. Whereas coloration frequency was where someone said, I wanted to make it warm, or I wanted to give it more bite, or I wanted to make it more airy, for example, okay? So it's reasonably well understood what warm, bright, airy, and so on. They're to do with affecting the frequency content of the sound. So those are the original codes. And then, again, if you're familiar with grounded theory, we kind of try and lump them together, try and kind of put them in axial coding, as it's called. And essentially, I was kind of said, okay, so we've got this temporal change which puts together all these things where it's changed in the sort of what we might call the dynamics of the signal. So either pumping or affecting the transient, that sort of transient design type stuff. Nonlinear coloration, that put together anything to do with distortion or changing the frequency aspect of the signal. Linear output, again, was just for those few examples where people said they wanted the compressor to sound transparent, which is a fair, it's kind of one of those things that seems to not make sense when you think about it, but sometimes it makes a lot of sense, right? If you're compressing the vocal particularly, you often don't want it to sound like it's compressed. So that's kind of that, from that code, that's the type of things that people were saying normally around vocals. And then the red category is just the standard, dynamic range control. I wanted to make the bass more even. I wanted to level things out. The type of behavior that we would think a compressor would do. And if you kind of lump them all together, we can see that, again, this is what I need to make clear, that in this sample set that I looked at, just under 80% of the discussions were around the compressor to kind of, sorry, just to be clear, when it says linear, I put together the standard compression techniques and also the compression techniques where we don't want it to have an effect. So essentially, this is just lumped together standard compression techniques where we don't want to hear the compressor together, and this is lumped everything else together. So the distortion, the coloration, the pumping, and so on. Okay? So we can see that 80% of the time in these discussions, that's what they're talking about, which is interesting, but obviously we've got to take it with a pinch of salt. These are in interviews. Obviously, the mix engineers, the producers might want to say interesting, tasty little nuggets of information. They may not be talking about so much the times when the compressor was just using its standard form. So we obviously have to take that as a limitation. But in terms of the result, that's the result I got, which was quite interesting. I wasn't, to be honest, expecting it to be that high a percentage for this talk around coloration and so on, which then informed the rest of my study. Went on to focus specifically on that. So, just as a comparison, so the original had 279 articles between 2013 actually. Okay, so 1999 2013. The update that I did last year extended that from 2013 to 2023. I just wanted to compare the two data sets, the original and the new, just to see if anything was kind of changing. Just again, I wasn't able to get into a kind of granular level of this. I was only able to just make some just general observations. So I just basically normalized them per 100 articles because there was a little bit of a difference in the amount of articles, obviously. Not much, but a little bit. And I just wanted to see what, per 100 articles, if there was any increase or decrease in the mention or discussion of these things. We can see across the board there's, well, if you look at total per source, there is much more talk about compression than the recent articles. We can see some, we can see a few small little decreases, but it's relatively insignificant. But what we can see here is an increase in this other gain production category. Okay, so that's kind of where we're getting most of our increase. Is around these discussions of other styles of compressors. Now, really, most of that increase is coming from software is kicking in at that point. Okay, so software compressors are kicking in. So we're getting compressors like the Waves Renaissance, where it's not one or the other style of compressor. It's a software compressor that'll do everything. Yeah, we're getting increases in waves, multiband, C4, C1s. So we're starting to get all these other compressors that are coming in. And it's quite interesting as I was looking through that. You can kind of see little themes emerging, little clusters, where engineers were using this particular type of compressor, and then 2 years later it's disappeared and the next one comes up. So that was quite interesting. And there was sort of a slight difference in approach. The reason, again, also why we've got more mentions of compressors is because they were using more compression, because in software we can have more than one compressors. And as computers became more powerful around that time, we could have more of them. And I think this is the time where compression, digital compression, was starting to become good. Up until that point, it had been quite a weak aspect of digital signal processing. And around that point, and it'll be interesting to see from, now that I'm starting to do the second study, if we can kind of start to track any changes. So those are some of the conclusions generally from the study. I've made those points as I've been going across, so we kind of get this. Sometimes you're using compressors for binary opposite sources, so upfront aggressive vocal compression versus the smoother compression for drums, pumping compression versus more glued compression. Cheers, lots for the drum buses and so on and so forth. Now, if I just skip forward actually into this kind of future work. So at the minute I'm working on a new study, which I have to be honest is driving me absolutely insane because it's a little bit more robust, and I'm kind of kicking myself for taking it on. One of the downsides was that I kind of lumped together lots of stuff. I didn't track genres. I didn't track dates. I wasn't tracking. So in this, there's no lumping together. There's dates tracked. There's genres tracked. And the way I'm kind of going through it is I kind of got this spreadsheet, as you can see. Don't ask me, it's only not even halfway through yet. Okay, where it's recording all the different compressors, it's recording the artist, the genre, it's recording the producer, the mixer year, release year, the article, where it's recorded. It's recording also if it was in mixing or tracking, whether it was on a channel group, insert part. So it's got all of this stuff, and that's why it's driving me insane. You can figure out how long it takes to do that per article. But it's quite interesting, and I haven't had a chance to really go through the data too much, but I thought before it come out today, I'd just very quickly run some stuff through a little Python script to analyze some of it. First thing that comes out, at the minute, I think I've went from 2011, I've currently done like a 6-year period, okay, so I think it's from, that wouldn't make sense. I think it's from 2006 to 2012, I think. Okay, so just this is the one thing a lot of people will probably ask. Okay, well, what's going on with hardware and software at that point? Well, we just I'm not looking at any detail at the minute. I just quickly ran a script to lump this together and look at what's going on, and we can see that we're almost getting to the point now where we're getting we're almost getting close to like a 50-50 split between the use of hardware and software. This is just as a whole, okay? And this is specifically when it comes to mixing. The reason why we haven't got one for tracking is because in tracking, it's 100% hardware, okay? So when they're tracking, they're using all the hardware. Makes sense, obviously. They're not tracking anything through software. And then when they get to the mixing stage, we're now getting to a point where we're starting to see much more software used than the hardware. Interestingly, if we look at mixing, again, I haven't went through this, and sorry for the little key over here. We can see that still in certain sources, for example, drum rooms, hardware persists 100% of the time. Engineers in that sample are still using hardware compressors for that type of processing. The snare, again, it seems to be that's an important, arguably in pop music, right? The vocal and the snare drum, for better or for worse, are probably the two most important pieces of source material. But if we do look at the lead vocal here, we can see even though it's still very popular to use it with a hardware compressor, software is creeping in. Now, again, I haven't went through the analysis. But I can figure out possibly what's going on here is that Things like Waves, Renaissance, things like the software compressors are coming in to kind of like just fix the dynamic control of things. Whereas when they want to impart character and get the sound and get the distortion and get the coloration, they're using a hybrid approach on the vocal. But you can see sources that are of less importance. Unfortunately, sorry, piano players, piano or any synth sounds. The software compressors are kind of doing quite well there. In terms of genre, again, and sorry, yeah, this is overall. So yeah, this is overall. This is lumping both the tracking and the mixing. So what we looked at previously before was just the mixing stage. This also talks about the track and recording stage. And we can see that when we put that together, yeah, we definitely still have, with excluding, piano, synth, vocal, rap, which I'll get to in a second actually, we still have, this use of hardware compressors is definitely still persisting. When we do look at it per genre, I mean, that's what it says quite interesting, that and again, I just did this really quickly this morning. When it says all knowing, that is pretty much all software compressors. Yeah? It's kind of lumped together. And when we look at something like hip hop, we can see that there is a much, at least at this point in time, there is a much bigger usage of software compressors versus if we go to rock, for example. Okay, and we've just got software compressors there. So still all very hardware based. And again, we can kind of see, it's quite interesting. I'm surprised at this one myself. Indies lumping together anything that was an indie production. So, and to be clear, sometimes these indie productions weren't small scale productions, but they were with bands that were indie bands, indie pop, indie rock, whatever it may be. And I find it quite interesting that in those productions, the kind of software compressors were implemented more so than in rock style productions, which you would have thought that maybe it's a similar result. So, different approaches from mixers, maybe different budget considerations, different sizes of studios and so on, maybe larger scale productions, or maybe they were just adopting this type of technology earlier. I think probably from hip hop, a lot of these productions maybe were done in smaller studios, smaller scale productions, maybe at the time. So that might explain why we have that much higher percentage for hip hop. So yeah, that's the end of the presentation. I just said one last thing actually. Sorry. Yeah. So one other study that is in. This was. I don't think we're going to IEEE. So maybe some of you know that I used to work in engineering. So at the time, in a nutshell, I conducted a study into the LA2A compressor. So what we wanted to understand, a couple of things, with a lot of hardware compressors in particular, there's a lot of, what's the word, with mythical status applied to different units, and then different variations, and this one's better, and this is the classic, and you don't really have an LA2A unless you've got this one. So I managed to find in the UK 6 different LA2As from different eras, some of the classic vintage ones, some of the modern recreations, and a really old school version called the LA2, which was in a studio at the time called State of the Arc. I think it was the guy that wrote Tina Turner's What's Love Got to Do with It. I can't remember his name, but yeah, he was the songwriter. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of kind of engineering-y stuff in this one, okay? But in a nutshell, what I did, or worked with Chris a little bit on this, Chris Dewey, one of my colleagues, we've done some objective analysis where we put all sorts of measurements through the units to try and get an understanding. And we wanted to see if we did it kind of statistically, if we could kind of lump together these units into different groups, basically. So we extracted all sorts of different things, the distortion over different frequency bands. I'll not bore you with it. I'll be honest. It's about a year since I've actually started working on this paper, so I was looking at it this morning, going, "What the hell have I done there?" But there's all sorts of different analysis going on. There's attack time measurements, so they trying to get a really thorough understanding, precise understanding of the length of time it takes. Because the LA2A's got a multiple stage attack and release, so we wanted to measure that and see if there was variation over the units. Yeah, etc., etc. Anyway, in a nutshell, what we did is we kind of clustered it together and found that we looked at like 3 different clusters or groups and 6 different groups, and essentially we can see this kind of pattern emerging of models. So I can't remember the exact LA2As, but LA2A 2, 3, and 6 grouped together into a unique little cluster, and 1, 4, and 5 grouped together into a unique little cluster. Okay, so that's suggesting that they're the most dissimilar from one another. And then I kind of then went through and worked out which were the most different from those 2 groups. So essentially found out the 2 most different units that we had, right, that showed the objective biggest difference. And from that, I wanted to see whether anyone could actually tell the difference in an experiment. Okay. Now, I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting much, but so we ended up having 17 listeners in an ABX test. So if anyone's ever done an ABX test, so you're given 2 audio stimuli, and one of them's X, and you have to listen to A and B and decide which one's X. Okay. And then you do that multiple times. So obviously, if you only do it once, there's a 50-50 chance, which is no good. But the more iterations, the more trials we have of that, then by working out the statistics for it, you can figure out how many correct answers we need for each trial, which is a bit of a weird way it's worked out. Sometimes the higher you go, the less you need. But anyway, so we got 17 people did it 10 times over 3 songs. So we had 170 trials, and then multiplied those by 3. We had 510 trials. So basically, what was needed in order for it not to be chance, someone just guessing, or our group of listeners guessing, we needed to have 96 correct answers out of 170, which is maybe lower than you might think. And then for 510, we needed to have 274. So in both instances, actually, we had, so those are our correct answers. So for to be 95% confidence, we needed that, and those are our correct answers. So you can see in song 2, we just about tipped over the bar, and to be honest, I don't think that's reliable, to be perfectly honest. But as a whole, we've not done that bad. So we got 304 correct answers, and our threshold was 274. So the statistics say yes, that people can tell the difference between these 2 units. Now, of course, the problem with an LA2A, with that type of test, is we don't know the magnitude of that, where you can just tell, yeah, they can tell the difference, but we don't know if, how much difference they can hear as such. So yeah, so that was quite an interesting result. As far and for total disclaimer, in a reflective research perspective, I wasn't expecting that one. I'll have to admit, I might have been a little bit biased whenever I conducted that experiment, but that's the result that came out. I was very surprised that with those very small, trust me, those LA2As, in that particular context, the differences are quite small. But there's something there about the listener. The listener can perceive these small differences in these same compressors, set as much as we could get them to be the same. Okay, we were trying to do that. Obviously, it's possible that if we went through and we did analyze something, perhaps there's been a flaw in the methodology that's given us this result. I don't know. But to the best of our ability, that's what we've got. So yeah, so that's another one that's kind of in the pipeline.
Can you remember what the criteria was for the differences between the different LO2As? Do you remember what the criteria of each, like, what did that one offer that one didn't, that you were getting people to judge?
They're just judging purely on what they hear.
Yeah, what were they listening for as well?
Difference.
Oh,
So on an ABX test, it is literally, can you tell the difference?
Oh, okay, fine.
So that's the nature of the test. Here's A, here's B, here's X. Which one's X?
Right.
And you got to go, I think A is X.
And were they just were they experts, or they were just general public?
Yeah, no. They were all final year students or master's students.
All right.
Yeah. So all final year students and master's students.
They're used to listening closely anyway.
Absolutely used. And again, if you drill through, the actual individuals, you'll see that there's a few participants that couldn't tell the difference in any of them, right? So they were below the threshold. So it's an interesting one, really. I think it's marginal. That, to me, is really on the cusp. I think, again, over a controlled environment, and I did interview some of them about how they were listening to things and what they were doing, and I actually spoke to participant 17 who could identify them all. Not all of the time, but he was statistically able to identify them enough of the time. And they kind of explain, well, actually, they kind of like went round and round certain little portions of the audio. So they were actually really microscopically listening to the audio. which was something that we put in the listening experiment, and it's one of those things when you're doing those type of tests, you got to decide whether you just make it on a holistic judgment, one listen, or you allow people to scope out when they want to listen to the audio. I think maybe if we hadn't have done that, and that listener hadn't been able to do that, we wouldn't have got the statistical significance. I've got a feeling, and that that's actually something I've said in the report. So yeah, it's as sure as we can be. But again, my gut reaction is, just on a purely holistic level, one or two listens, very difficult to be able to discern the difference between those two. So yeah, that's kind of further insights into dynamic range compression. Thank you very much.
You had a chart up a bit ago when you were talking about the instruments.
Yes.
I think it's the one right there. Well, but with instruments, not genres.
Yeah, that's that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious. Here, there's guitar and there's guitars.
Yes.
What is the distinction that you're drawing there?
Good question, Steve. So the you know what the distinction is? The distinction is that I have I've got a plural in one of the categories and not in the other, and whenever I lump these together, I haven't lumped them together in the analysis. So they're the same thing.
Okay. I was wondering if it was like lead guitar
No,
versus like rhythm guitar or something like that.
No, that's a good question. As I said, I did this really quickly this morning, so I probably made some mistakes in the analysis. But in the spreadsheet that I've used to input things, I've obviously made a few typos, so I kind of like on the fly was trying to fix the typos. And obviously this is one that I've spotted. I'm pretty sure I do have it as solos. I'm pretty sure I do in that spreadsheet have it down to guitar solos. That could be guitar solo. It's truncated the rest of it, so I need to have a look. It could be. But yeah, it's either a mistake in me generating this plot, which is a product of me just making a typo in the spreadsheet,
right.
or that is actually guitar solos and it should be. But it would have a space between it. But it's possible. But no, unfortunately I can't answer the question on that one.
Okay.
Could I ask there's so many questions that come up from what you've gone through here, but it covers so many different topics in theory, doesn't it? There's so many spin-offs you could get from this sort of detailed analysis. But first thing that struck me is that actually I'm actually surprised there's that software compression hasn't completely taken over more. I mean, it's still looking at that. I'm surprised that hardware compression is still used so much. Actually, obviously, what you haven't discussed is why. Yeah. But that presumably people still think they're better. But and that's then we get into that whole argument about hardware and software, don't we? And yet it's all digital, presumably. Yeah. Although some of them might be using still analog. I mean, some of them was but you talked about tracking, where obviously you're saying that obviously in a way tracking with software compression doesn't really make any sense. So I presume what you mean by that is with hardware compression they are burning it in.
Yes.
So and then because the other question there is why are they doing that and why because the point about software is that you don't have to you could put some on for a bit just to help, but when someone's performing, but otherwise. You can just tweak it later, but with hardware compression, you're deliberately saying no, this is it, and that's why they would use hardware rather than because software you just turn it on and off anyway. Was that part of discussions they were saying? I mean, given that the fact that you don't have to do that anymore, that people are still clearly choosing to do it if they use it at all. I presume you presume the others who wouldn't ever use compression at that stage anyway if they're just tracking it. I don't know. I've done recording, but I'm not a huge expert in recording technology.
Well, yeah, a couple of points. So remember, this is only at the minute up to 2013, 2014 thing, right? So at the minute, that's as far as I.
Oh, right. So it's going out of date.
So yeah, so we're in that. We're just in that little
cusp
window where it's starting.
It's
to
probably
so,
changed
so
now.
Exactly. So I'm expecting it to change as we go on. However. I think so from my experience, again, I guess working in the industry, doing this job, speaking to people, engineers and so on, interviewing them, there still is this thing persisting, for better or for worse, for whatever reason, that, the hardware creates this coloration, it creates this sound, and they want to bake that into the recording before they then get into the software processing. And then I think attitudes are changing, but then it would be okay. Well, we've got the hardware goodness now in the signal. We can now use our waves processors or whatever it is to simply just adjust dynamic range and so on, or whatever it is. We're not as concerned, but they're becoming less concerned with that. But I think attitudes towards that are changing. So I think there is more acceptance that yes, we can get more of that coloration from software. I think for a number of years there was the view that it took a while for compression to catch up in terms of the quality that software offered, at least the perceived quality versus the hardware. I think now in the last few years, there's general consensus that we've we've pivoted over, and it's almost as good.
But of course, their algorithms are
producers.
all based on the hardware. That the hardware is still lives on in a sense, isn't it? Because the hardware forms the basis of the way that all these compressors still work. At least that's what they want you to think.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And this is something I've never really been very clear about. When you go on a software compressor, you've got FET, Opto.
Yeah.
You can just click, can't you, and choose one. That's some kind of emulation of the hardware, which you just have to trust, I guess, if you don't actually know the units themselves. I mean, they do sound different, but it's an interesting. I always find it, and then you get the interfaces.
Yeah.
I mean, there's this very weird. We like software, but we don't we? Because we make it all feel like it's hardware, except we can't. There's a whole weird world of that. So the interfaces are really impractical often, aren't they? Because you're sort of trying to turn knobs, which is stupid because it doesn't. The mouse it doesn't lend itself, but. I still turn that on nevertheless, even though you can go to the controls where it's just sliders. I still don't like it. It's a weird psychology. We're messed up, really, aren't we?
It's interesting because obviously Chris Dewey, who I've worked with in Alton Engineering, his kind of study was around HCI user interfaces, and I can't remember exactly what the kind of the theory is or the explanation, but there is a. At a point where we're transferring from one thing to the other, there is that sort of point where we got to give the user what they're familiar with. We got to give them that familiarity. So whether that familiarity is a graphical representation of a piece of hardware, or even down to maybe it's not a graphical representation of the hardware, but it's still called. There's no reason for them to call a software compressor a FET. There's no reasons for them to build in the limitations. But I think it was probably for that transitional period.
But it's still going on, though, isn't it?
But it's still going on.
So I don't think it is that anymore, is it?
And it's still, I have 18-year-old kids that have never used a tape machine in their life, and they don't even know how it works, but they're using GUIs off a Studer 800 that went out of date
tape
in the
saturation
mid-1980s. So, that's another study completely.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one that we I think a lot of it's convenience, isn't it? I think, and maybe money, I don't know, in the sense that it's just all there, isn't it, in the software? That's a lot of it, seems to me, and they're easier to use, aren't they, than having to plug in hardware. And if you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, I had this conversation with, particularly first-year students, say, okay, hardware versus software, and I kind of say, well, look, we got two things to consider. Number one, we've got cost, we got the perceived sonic quality, and then we got your bang for buck as such. And in terms of bang for buck, that outweighs the perceived difference in sonic quality to me. You can have as many of these for 50 quid that your computer can run, versus one of these for £3,000, and the difference in quality is not large enough to actually outweigh the difference in cost and accessibility.
Hardware will remain niche, won't it? We'll get into philosophical discussion about how much hardware will remain niche in sort of everything we do as time wears on. We don't really know, and software will take over.
Thinking about some related issues, could you just specify a little more like what the time period was in which those different compressors that you identified came out?
Yeah. Again, this is going to be
kind of got a sense
off the top. It's going to be off the top of my head. So I can't remember which one came first, Steve. Whether it was Fairchild or the LA2E, but we're talking roughly. Roughly 60s. I think probably around the mid 60s,
Okay.
and then that late 60s going into the early 70s, and then this kind of mid 70s going up to about the early 80s.
So these are all like machines that are almost 40 to 50 years old.
Yep.
So that's interesting. I mean, I'm thinking about this in relation with some of the things Jeff is kind of prompting. You know, these were hardware, right? And one of the things I guess I'm wondering is how much, it seems like these kind of set, are you suggesting, I'm hearing you kind of suggest that these are different modes of compression, but collectively they kind of set a standard for what compression sounded like, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how much is software basically just reiterating what these machines were already doing, and how much is software actually like expanding or allowing for capabilities that were not already built into these hardware items?
I mean, it's a really interesting conversation. So, again, this is just totally, off the cuff. I would guess that even to this day, software compressors, at least 60% of software compressors, at least 60% of software compressors coming that exist now are versions of that. They will look like it, and they will have the limitations of the device. At least, probably even going back a little bit further, probably 80% of them are like that. And so, I mean, for example, so the software versions of all of these have only recently had controls that the original didn't have, simply through users sitting saying, why not? We can have this. And I think there was a kind of argument that, well, we want to keep it authentic, we want to keep it like the real device.
Simple,
We don't want the cloud judgment, we want to keep that stuff up the same working conditions. So there was a bit of resistance to add these extra features, and it's quite, and again, it's not something that I've studied, but you can, if you were to do that analysis, you would be able to look at these kind of, this attitude of let's keep it authentic, let's keep it real, let's keep it like the original device, versus let's update it. And then, well, okay, if we update it, how much do we update it? What are the parameters that we're going to update? Where are we going to cost? And then you get to the decision, well, if we update this so much, why not? Let's just get rid of it.
Well, yeah,
Let's
well
get rid
then
of the
you
GUI and
end
make
up, the
something
trouble
new.
with the software stuff is that you end up with a million controls.
Exactly.
And you've no idea what to do.
Precisely, yeah.
I mean, I bought something the other day, which was a software thing, and it just had one knob.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a compressor, and I thought it was great because what it did was really good. It was a dynamic. It was a thing that controlled the dynamics by frequency.
Yeah.
And it's just one knob, and it's just basically it's a coloration. You just turn it on, but it was great. It was perfect for what I needed. I didn't want any other controls.
Yeah.
But you could have had 100 controls on it probably.
Yeah.
So there is something about that simplicity that it is what it is in a sense.
I mean,
if you want something more complicated, use this.
I've made the argument that compressor has been so popular in studios for vocals and tracking because you've got one knob.
Yeah.
That's it. It does the job, and if it doesn't do the job, well, we try something else. But if it doesn't, it's like that's it. You make that decision based upon that knob. So I would say in a tracking situation, that especially for vocals, and it is one of the most popular compressors even to this day for tracking vocals, that's why it persists.
How much do you think? You discussed this when you went through the stats about whether it was just used as a sort of utilitarian tool, in a sense, to control dynamics, or even just make something very transparent, which I guess is what they were originally designed for, in theory. All of them probably originally, and then they became a creative tool, repurposed as a creative tool, and that happened quite early. Although I don't know whether you've studied the way that's progressed. I mean, I think about Joe Meek, he used it quite creatively. He was one of those people that says, right, I'm going to make a punch. And you still listen to some of those records and think, whoa, that's quite... Yeah. Although the music sounds old-fashioned, the production still sounds surprisingly modern in the way he did things. He built his own, apparently, I don't know. Yeah. Or he modified them. He modified them. But I wondered whether you've ever tracked that shift, or whether as you say now, most, was it 80% of the discussion was essentially about a kind of coloration, about a creative use, as opposed to just a standard use of trying to make things smoother and clearer. Whether that has genuinely increased, and whether software has enabled that, or whether it's just the styles have changed. I mean, compression's a funny business because there's so much discussion about what is actually a relatively simple conception compared to other, the input controls the output sort of thing levels. Yeah. That's it, isn't it, really? And yet there's a million other effects, but this one, and it's the most controversial, the loudness was, you know what I mean? It goes on and on, doesn't it? It's such a huge sort of thing. Yeah. And as to whether the tracking of that creative use has definitely evolved and increased, and what's going on there.
I have to say that's a study for someone else. I was
Well,
hanging my hat up, man. Hanging my compression hat up a few years ago, and I
Yeah.
kind of went off it, and then I got back into it. And since doing this analysis with that spreadsheet, I'm like, right, that's me finished, guys.
Because what
So
strikes
I'm not going to do that.
what
But
strikes
it's
me
an
about those,
interesting study.
I accept it. It's a different kind of study,
Yeah.
but it's one that immediately I think is suggested by what you're talking about,
Yeah.
though, because the other thing, that word cloud.
Yeah.
Okay, so you got colour was the biggest one,
Yeah.
but if you look around it, most of the others are to do with what you might call. I suppose if I was to characteristic it, well, you could put lots of frames around it, but they're quite macho, aren't they?
Yeah.
You could look at that, or they're all about aggression, punch, power, you know, and that's how compression. Even though compression is essentially designed to keep things smooth, level. In fact, people do it to make the dynamic range bigger.
Yep.
Some, a really loud punch
Well, I think
followed
it's
by
the
backing
range
off,
closer, right?
and there's a kind of sense of
I think that depends.
it's like a drug though.
So
something.
I've always explained it though. If I come up now and start speaking into your ear, that sound relative to me here is compressed, isn't it?
Yeah.
So essentially, when you compress things, you're bringing them closer to the listener.
Yeah.
That's where this thing of power and aggression and energy comes from. Bringing it closer
but
to
also
the listener
that-
in your ear, in your face.
But when you back the attack off a bit,
Yeah.
and you get the transits bursting through and then pulled right back,
Yeah.
that's a very common thing, isn't it? It's where
Yeah.
the dynamic range is actually going up rather than down.
And it kind of punches.
Yeah,
right?
and it
you
is
got
like
that
a punch,
Yeah.
a kind of punch, and it's very effective.
Yeah.
But at the same time, in my own taste, it sometimes feels like a drug. Compression is like the biggest of all the units that we use. Compression seems like more like the drug, because once you've gone up there, how do you go back down?
Yeah.
And the listener's ears become attuned to the punch and the power and the aggression, and then you put something which has, we're not going to use much compression. We're just going to make this kind of nice and easy, even in a rock track.
Yeah.
And people will go, oh, it's not very well produced. Is it that? Or, it lacks something. Do you know what I mean? That's something that
I'll be honest, when I play that example where I crank the compressor, I'm guessing everybody was like, whoa. You
it sounds
get
good.
whoa, but
It does sound good, yeah.
It sounds exciting in the
But,
context of the
but
mix,
in the
it could
longer
ruin
term,
the mix,
but in the longer term,
Yeah.
the problem I think is sometimes that it's impressive. It's like when you have something to taste, that's delicious.
Yes.
But after a while, you think, I've had enough of it.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't want it. And it's getting back down to.
Yeah, I mean that's another study, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Well, the loudness wars that you
Yeah.
referenced, I think, that's precisely the point at which people were feeling fatigued from it, right?
Well, this is
Like,
back.
people
They
were-
did back off from them, didn't they? Yeah.
Yeah, like that it's always cranked all the time, and there's like a kind of listener fatigue that started to set in. But
Yeah.
also the complaint I remember, especially around the Red Hot Chili Peppers, right? They were like the punching bag for like the loudness wars, because the complaint was precisely the opposite of what I heard you say a minute ago. Like it completely eliminated dynamic range.
Yes,
Everything
yes.
was maxed,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So it was all up
Metallica
here,
as well had
and
that
there
one.
was none of that fluctuation in
Yeah.
intensity that actually gives music a sense of space, something that you can actually kind of get lost in. It's all surface. So I think, that's precisely a matter of practice, right? Like different producers are going to have different degrees to which they want to max stuff out, right? And the extent to which, I really like the way you broke it down by instrument, because that, I think,
Yeah.
gets a little more into the nitty gritty of like, this isn't just a surface.
Yeah.
It's like each component is kind of being treated in its own way. I'd like to see more of that analysis applied to specific songs, and kind of see how you can kind of hear that a little bit more refined, because that's something I haven't seen too many people do in a kind of
It's a genre element there as well, isn't there? I
Yeah.
agree with you about that. I think compression has incredible power for dynamic range, ironically. And you do hear some artists that use it like that tremendously. I remember there's a band called, is it At the Drive-In?
sure.
And they've got a tremendous dynamic range in their music, and the compression is like, oh, and then it's suddenly nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And then it bursts up again. It's like it's a real roller coaster. And Bark Psychosis is another group that use it. They're all slightly left field though. Those groups, aren't they?
They're
Whereas
indie.
I suppose more like
Indie
metal, you
categories.
want a left, but you want it up there, don't you? You're not
Yeah.
going to. Although I don't know, older metal had more dynamic range, didn't it? More space. So it's an interesting conundrum. But yeah, the loudness war seems to have been won by people who are a bit more sensible, I think, roughly. I don't know.
I mean, for Robbie goes, it's still going, it's still persistent.
Is it?
Yeah, I don't think it's gone.
Yeah, it's not gone away.
Is it not gone away? I just not.
Yeah.
Maybe I don't listen to. I mean, Oasis is one of the most notorious in the UK. They started it in the 90s
Definitely,
here
yeah.
with
Or
just
the-
it's just like
What's
that.
the story? Yeah, that was.
Yeah, I mean, they did. I don't know whether you ever saw that documentary on them, and it was funny. It was quite a good documentary. It wasn't a technical one, but they said, oh, the album was sounding awful, and then their engineer came. He says, oh, I've got this, and he turned it on. And they said, and everything sounded amazing. And they didn't
Yeah.
go into any of the they didn't say what it was. It's just he just ramped the compression up massively on that entire album, and it did work in a way. But yes, it was like.
I remember mixing someone for someone years ago, and oh, it's not happening. Oh, it doesn't sound good. And I was like, okay,
Bang a
crank
load
the
of
compressor
compression.
top. It's like, yeah, it sounds good now.
Well, there's also recently been a hoo-ha about SoundCloud, where when you upload files, they have a compressor and they squish everything.
Oh, do they?
Yeah, but it's recently got like quite extreme. So,
I didn't. I think they all have a bit of a. Just
Is- but
Spotify,
is it-
you can turn it off.
I think though, but is it being shown? I mean, it wouldn't surprise me that SoundCloud is it actually a compressor, or is it just literally doing some sort of normalization,
Normalisation.
of just turning it down?
probably not. I don't
But
know.
it's not. It wouldn't surprise me that there is a compressor on
I know it's
SoundCloud.
recently changed.
Wouldn't
in the
surprise
last
me
year.
because I've put things in SoundCloud and thought, hang on, you know.
I wonder if
Several
that's a commercial desperation. Aren't SoundCloud going bust or something? So I heard.
So another one drives me bonkers is on in a car. In my car, there's a little compressor on it.
Oh, is
you
it?
need to adjust it. So you know when you're driving, there's more noise. It turns it up.
Oh,
When
yeah,
you
yeah,
turn
yeah,
the lights,
yeah,
it
yeah.
turns it down.
Yeah, I always thought that was precisely the rationale for the compression to become so prevalent in the first place.
In
right?
the
It was
first
like,
place, yeah.
Right?
Literally,
The loudness has to be
in the environment.
Yeah,
yeah.
totally.
But that used to drive me crazy until I discovered it. I was like, what's happening?
We used to. I mean, I listen to Radio 3 sometimes, and the thing that I've noticed about Radio 3, it is compressed a bit, but not very much. If you look at the specs, it's a very low compression. I'm talking about broadcast media, of course, which is another whole topic, isn't it, in terms of compression. But was that the thing about that program is when you listen, sometimes you put that on, you think, hang on, is this on?
Mm.
You know, your ears have to adjust to the fact that there's almost no compression on that music, and the compression only comes. Well, there is. It comes through the music itself, which is another topic again, isn't it? You can.
Well, listen, that's the
When
other
you
thing,
play
isn't it?
loud and quiet, the
It's-
human beings compress, of course.
I mean, it's different. I mean, no. I mean, actually, if you do listen to some classical music, you're sometimes shocked at the compression that's put on those recordings. And it
You do
really-
get
it
somebody
really,
often-
and it really shouldn't. Really.
No, they-
It
well,
just-
they
it just
do it.
totally changes the dynamics.
I think commercial pressures sometimes.
Yeah.
We better draw it to an end there. But thanks very much, Justin. It's been excellent.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask, is that exhaustive list of like methods of hardware? Are there like other types of hardware compressors that like are not?
Which no,
Those
the
four.
more exhaustive list is this. Oh, not in this one. Yeah, so you might have missed that bit, or I might have just talked over it quickly. So in the original study, it was focusing specifically on cheers, Steve. It was focusing specifically on those compressors. Cheers. It was focusing specifically on those compressors, and then I rationalised it down to a general category. But in the new study, it goes through all of the one. It lists everything explicitly. So the only other two that would put into that category would be pulse width modulation and diodes. So there's another two styles of compression. So PWM, and I think there's not many of those. There's like the Pi compressor, and then diode bridge. It's like some of the Neves. And then it's just basically then it's the other categories: the valve, opto, FET, and VCA. But that basically it's the vast majority. But yeah, in terms of like, that's just in terms of like the compression topology. So like they're basically just categorized by what achieves the gain production. So what amplifier is being altered. So it's either a valve, it's either a little opto cell, it's either a FET, it's either a VCA, it's either a diode or PWM. I think PWM's actually, I think it's more to do with like how they represent the change. So it's like pulse width modulation, so presumably it's just like on and off something, I don't really know.
Are they newer ones? Those two?
PWMs and diode bridges, no. None of it's new. They probably all stopped around. So around about the 70s, 80s, that was basically it for compressor design. And then there was hardly anything in terms of hardware compressors that came out, because obviously what happened was there was a big change over to large format consoles like the SSL, so it had compressors in every channel. They were all VCAs, and you know, so a lot of engineers went, right, okay, we don't really need much more. We can use this, and we can use the racks that we've got, stuck with that. And then what happened, probably in about the mid-90s to early 90s, that's when digital kicked in. Still not like it is now, but there was that shift to moving away from large format consoles to either smaller consoles. So that's when like big desks started to get broken up into like little 8-channel units. And then I think some engineers started to, I think there was just a lot of demand for a new compressor, but like a do-it-all compressor. And then the distressor came out. But it was basically just a VCA compressor that sounded like the different styles. So you could make it sound like a Feta, you could make it sound like an Opto. And then that was the next big thing in hardware. And then everything since then has just been more expensive versions or cheaper versions or whatever it is, you know, luxury items. Smaller versions, more input, whatever, you know, and software. And I mean, I can't think of anything really in hardware that's came out that hasn't been one of those, that hasn't been based around that old technology.
It's that there's not any 50 years ago.
It's not really, but there's not really, yeah, exactly, but it's not really, what else can you kind of do? What else, there's no other component